When most of us picture life at sea in the age of sail, we picture the dramatic version. Towering waves crashing over the bow, pirates bearing down from the horizon, cannons roaring, swords flashing, some grizzled captain bellowing orders into a howling gale. It's a compelling image. It's also, for the vast majority of sailors throughout history, almost entirely wrong. The reality of life aboard a sailing ship was something far less cinematic, and in many ways far more interesting. Because if storms and battles weren't filling every hour, what actually was? What did a sailor do when the wind was steady, the sea was calm, and there was nothing on the horizon but more ocean? What filled the hours, the days, the weeks of a long passage that could stretch on for months without a single dramatic event? The answer, it turns out, tells us something remarkable about how human beings organize themselves under pressure. How skill and hierarchy and sheer physical endurance can keep a floating wooden machine alive in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. A ship was not a vessel that sailors simply rowed from one port to another. It was a system, a complex, constantly degrading system that demanded attention every single hour of every single day. Ropes frayed, sails tore, hulls leaked, iron rusted, wood rotted, and the sea worked tirelessly to unmake everything that human hands had built. Keeping a ship functional wasn't a task that got done and then stayed done. It was a labour that never ended, and the moment a crew let it slip, the consequences could be fatal. That constant pressure gave shipboard life a structure that might surprise you. There were routines so fixed and predictable that a sailor's day looked almost nothing like the chaos we associate with the sea. There were schedules, hierarchies, assigned duties, inspections, drills, and rituals that repeated day after day regardless of where in the world the ship happened to be. In many ways, a sailing ship operated less like an adventure and more like a factory, one that happened to be surrounded by water and could sink. But here's what makes this genuinely fascinating. The experience of that routine depended enormously on who you were. A ship's captain and a common deckhand technically lived aboard the same vessel, but they inhabited almost entirely different worlds. A surgeon, a carpenter, a gunner, a cook, a young boy just learning the ropes, each of them moved through the ship's day along a completely different path, with different responsibilities, different dangers, and different ways of experiencing time. Rank shaped everything. So did skill, age, and the type of ship you happened to be sailing on. A warship operated on different rhythms than a merchant vessel. A crew in tropical waters faced different daily realities than one battling through the North Atlantic. The history of life at sea is not one story. It's dozens of overlapping stories happening simultaneously on the same deck. So, over the course of this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on all of it. We're going to walk through an actual shipboard day, from the moment the morning watch began to the last exhausted man collapsing into his hammock at night. Every task, every duty, every hidden layer of labour that kept the crew alive, and the ship moving. Because the truth of what sailors actually did all day is stranger, harder, and more human than the legend ever was. Think of a wooden sailing ship as a living argument against entropy. The moment she left port, the sea began dismantling her. Salt water attacked every iron fitting, every wooden joint, every inch of cordage not treated with enough tar or grease. The sun dried and cracked timber. The constant flexing of the hull under sail worked caulking loose from seams that had been perfectly tight just weeks before. A ship did not hold together on its own. It held together because people never stopped making it hold together. This is the foundational reality that explains almost everything about daily life at sea. Every task a sailor performed, no matter how tedious or seemingly trivial, was connected to that single underlying truth. Scrubbing the deck wasn't about cleanliness in any domestic sense. It was about catching the early signs of rot before rot became catastrophic. Tarring the rigging wasn't a cosmetic exercise. It was the difference between ropes that held and ropes that snapped under load at the worst possible moment. Even something as mundane as coiling a line properly had life or death logic behind it, because a rope that ran foul in an emergency could kill a man or cost the ship a sail in a storm. So when sailors worked, they weren't filling time. They were maintaining a fragile machine that had no margin for neglect. What's interesting is how that work was organised. Rather than something resembling a modern working day with a beginning and an end, a sailing ship operated on a watch system, a rotating cycle that divided the crew into groups and kept the ship manned and functional at every hour of every day, including through the night. Different navies and merchant services structured this in different ways, and we'll get into the specifics shortly, but the essential point is this. The ship had no off hours. There was always a portion of the crew on duty, always someone responsible for the sails, the helm, the lookout, and the endless low-level maintenance that kept everything from slowly coming apart. This system shaped a sailor's sense of time in ways that would feel deeply alien to most of us. Sleep was fragmented. Meals came at odd hours. A man might be hauling on ropes in the middle of the night and trying to sleep through the noise of the working crew just a few hours later. The ship's bell measured time, not the sun, and a sailor's internal clock calibrated itself to those rhythms rather than the natural rhythms of daylight and dark. Layered over this watch system was rank, and rank determined nearly everything about what your day actually looked like. At the top, officers planned, observed, navigated, and commanded. They solved problems. They made decisions. Their hands rarely touched rope unless conditions demanded it. Below them, petty officers, boatswains, gunners, mates, quartermasters supervised specific departments and were responsible for the skills and conduct of the men under them. And at the bottom, ordinary seamen and landsmen performed the raw physical labour that kept the ship moving, hauling, climbing, scrubbing, pumping, and hauling some more. Rank didn't just determine your duties. It determined where you slept, what you ate, how much privacy you had, and in very direct terms, how much your physical body suffered over the course of a voyage. What makes this worth understanding before we walk through any specific daily routine is the idea of what you might call invisible work, the labour that happened on perfectly calm, unremarkable days when nothing dramatic was occurring, and the logbook recorded little of note. A ship on a quiet day was still being kept alive by dozens of hands doing dozens of things that would never appear in any historical narrative. Seams were being caulked. Pumps were being worked because wooden ships always leaked to some degree. Gear was being inspected, mended and stowed. That background hum of maintenance never stopped. The adventure, when it came, was built on top of all of that quiet, unglamorous labour. And without it, the ship never would have survived long enough to find any adventure at all. So what did that system actually look like in practice? How did a crew of dozens or hundreds of men organise themselves so that a ship was never left without hands on deck, no matter the hour? The answer was the watch system, and it was the skeleton around which every other part of daily life was arranged. In the British Royal Navy, and in most European naval and merchant services of the Age of Sail, with some variations, the crew was divided into two main groups, typically called the starboard watch and the larboard watch, larboard being the older term for what we now call port, the left side of the ship. These two groups alternated duty in shifts, so that while one watch was on deck and responsible for the ship, the other was theoretically below, resting or attending to other tasks. The logic was simple and necessary. A ship required human attention continuously, and no individual human being could sustain that indefinitely. By splitting the crew in half and rotating them, you kept the ship perpetually manned without killing the men in the first few weeks. On a typical 4-hour rotation, a sailor would stand watch for 4 hours, go below for 4 hours, then return topside for another 4. Repeat this for days, weeks and months at a stretch, and you begin to understand why the sailor's relationship with sleep was so fundamentally different from a landsman's. 4 hours off was not 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Time had to be found to eat, to perform personal maintenance, to attend to any duties specific to the man's station. In practice, continuous sleep of even 3 hours was a luxury that many sailors rarely enjoyed for weeks at a time. The body adapted more or less. Sailors became expert at what might be called fractured sleep, the ability to drop into unconsciousness quickly, wake without ceremony, and function despite exhaustion that would have disabled most people ashore. Time itself was measured differently at sea, and this is where the sandglass enters the picture. Mechanical clocks existed by the age of sail's peak, but they were expensive, delicate, and unreliable on a moving, vibrating ship subject to salt air and drastic temperature changes. The sandglass, a glass vessel with sand flowing from one chamber to another in a precise measured time, was far more practical and far more common. The standard ship's sandglass ran for 30 minutes. A boy, often one of the youngest members of the crew, was assigned to watch the glass and turn it the moment the sand ran through, then strike the ship's bell accordingly. Each half-hour earned 1 bell, and the count ran up through the 4-hour watch before resetting at the change. 8 bells marked the end of a watch. 4 bells meant you were halfway through. This system was so deeply embedded in maritime culture that it structured not just schedules but language. Sailors thought and spoke in bells rather than clock hours. Getting the time wrong was a serious matter. A boy who fell asleep on glass watching duty could throw off the count, which cascaded into errors in navigation, in meal timing, in the relief of the watch. There's reasonable evidence that glass turning was treated as a genuine responsibility rather than a trivial chore, precisely because timekeeping was structural. The ship's bells could be heard across the vessel, through decks, and over wind, giving every member of the crew, on duty or off, an audible reference point for where they stood in the day's rhythm. Even half asleep in a hammock, a sailor knew from the bell count roughly how long he had before he'd be needed topside again. Now here is where something genuinely clever enters the system, because a strict 2-watch alternation had an obvious problem. If the starboard watch stood duty from noon to 4 in the afternoon on Monday, they would stand the same watch on Tuesday and the day after that forever. Each watch would permanently own certain hours, including the preferable ones and the brutal overnight stretches. This was both unfair and, in a practical sense, bad for morale. The solution was the dog watch. The period between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock in the evening, often considered the most desirable hours, when the day's work was winding down and men might have some leisure, was split into 2 short watches of 2 hours each. These were the dog watches, and their exact origin is one of those nautical etymology mysteries that historians enjoy debating without reaching firm consensus. What they accomplished, though, is clear. By inserting 2 2-hour periods where there had previously been 1 4-hour block, the daily total of watches became an odd number. This meant the rotation shifted, so that the watch who had certain hours on one day would have different hours the next. The burden of the midnight watch, the 4 in the morning watch, the worst hours, rotated through the crew rather than being permanently assigned to the same men. It was an elegant mechanical solution to a fairness problem built into the system itself. The dog watches also had a social dimension worth noting. With both watches briefly assembled on deck during those transitional evening hours, there was more opportunity for communal activity, music, conversation, storytelling, the informal socializing that was one of the few outlets available to men living in an extraordinarily confined and regimented environment. The dog watch wasn't designed with leisure in mind, but it created a space where leisure could happen, and sailors made use of it. What this entire system produced was a relationship with time that had almost nothing in common with life ashore. On land, time was organized around the sun. People woke with daylight and slept after dark. Meals came at recognizable points in the solar day, and the division between work and rest had a natural rhythm underneath it. At sea, the ship's bell replaced the sun as the primary timekeeper. A sailor coming off the midnight watch didn't experience that as unusual. It was simply when his watch ended A sailor eating breakfast at 2 in the morning wasn't confused. It was simply when his off-watch hours fell. The day and night bled together into an unbroken cycle, measured in 4-hour increments, and the body learned to find its bearing inside that cycle, rather than inside any natural rhythm of light and dark. This is crucial context for everything that follows about what sailors actually did, because the activities, the cleaning, the sail handling, the maintenance, the meals, all happened inside this temporal structure. There was no single unified morning when the whole crew rose together, no single evening when everyone stopped working. The watch system meant that the ship was always in motion, always alive with some portion of its crew in action, even in the deep quiet of the middle of the night, somewhere out on an ocean where no one else would ever know what they were doing, or how relentlessly the bells kept marking the hours. And so the bells kept marking the hours through the night, until the particular sequence that signalled something different was coming. Not just the rotation of watches, but the beginning of what the ship collectively understood as morning. Even aboard a vessel where the crew never truly rested all at once, morning still existed as a recognised event. It had a character, a set of rituals, a specific kind of organised noise. And that noise, more often than not, began with water on wood. On most naval and merchant vessels of the age of sail, the morning routine typically started in the pre-dawn hours, often around 5 o'clock or earlier depending on the season, the captain's preferences and the ship's current situation. The first order of business was washing the decks, and this was not a gentle domestic task. It was hard physical labour conducted in the dark and the cold, before the sun had fully risen, often while the ship was still under way and the sea was doing whatever it pleased beneath their feet. Sailors worked in teams with buckets, pumps, holystones and swabs. The holystone, a block of soft sandstone, sometimes the size of a brick and sometimes much larger, dragged across the deck on the end of a rope, was used to scrub the planking until it was pale and smooth. The name has its own small mystery, with some historians suggesting the stones were called holy because sailors had to kneel to use them, in a posture uncomfortably like prayer, while others connect the name to the stone's porous, almost sponge-like texture. Whatever the etymology, the effect was thorough. Water was pumped or bucketed across the deck, the stone was worked across the grain of the planking, and then the whole surface was swabbed dry with long mops, or sometimes by stretching canvas over the boards and dragging it fore and aft to pull the water off before it could soak in and sit. Why did this matter so much? Partly it was practical in the most immediate sense. A wet, gritty or fouled deck was a dangerous deck. Sailors moved quickly across those surfaces in all conditions, climbing, hauling, running, and a slip at the wrong moment could mean falling overboard or into the rigging. Keeping the wood clean and reasonably smooth reduced that risk, but the reasons went deeper than traction. Standing water rotting into planking was a structural threat. A ship's deck was both its flaw and a key element of its integrity, and neglect accumulated quickly in the marine environment. Vermin and disease took hold in filth, and in a vessel housing dozens or hundreds of men in close quarters, with poor ventilation and limited medical resources, any foothold gained by preventable illness could become catastrophic. Cleanliness in this environment was genuinely a matter of survival, not a preference. There was also a dimension of command to it that went beyond hygiene entirely. Requiring the crew to begin each day with collective physical labour, organised, supervised and visibly productive, was a way of asserting order over the ship at the start of every single day. The act of cleaning was simultaneously the act of claiming the space, and the officers who supervised it were watching something more than whether the decks were being properly scrubbed. They were watching who was present, who was sluggish, who was following direction, and who was not. The morning routine was the first checkpoint of the day, and it set the tone for everything that followed. A captain who allowed slovenly mornings tended, in the observations of contemporaries and naval historians, to command slovenly ships in all respects. Once the deck washing was under way or complete, inspections followed, And these were not perfunctory walkthroughs. Officers moved through the ship with genuine attention. On a well-run naval vessel, the first lieutenant in particular bore enormous responsibility for the ship's physical condition, and would have had his own practised eye for anything out of order. What they were checking covered an enormous range. Was the rigging in good order after the night? Had anything chafed, stretched, or worked loose in the hours of darkness? Were the sails properly furled or set as needed? Had any equipment been left unsecured? Were the guns properly housed and the tackles in place? Was the bilge being pumped, and was the water level in it acceptable? Were the hatches clear, the ropes coiled correctly, the tools and implements in their proper locations? That last point, proper locations for everything, might seem almost obsessively bureaucratic, but on a ship it was the difference between a crew that could function in an emergency and one that couldn't. If a sail needed changing quickly in a building storm, there was no time to hunt for the right line. If a fire broke out, the firefighting equipment needed to be exactly where it was supposed to be. Not approximately there, not nearby, but there. The organisation of the ship's gear was functional necessity given a physical vocabulary of habit. Morning inspection enforced that vocabulary, and the officers who conducted it knew what they were looking at well enough to notice a missing marlinspike as readily as a cracked spar. The night watch, however careful, inevitably left the ship in a slightly different condition from how it had been the previous evening. Ropes had been handled and not perfectly recoiled. Running rigging might need re-rove or adjusted after use in the dark. Sails that had been managed through shifts in wind or brief squalls needed attention in daylight, checking for any new wear in the fabric, any loose stitching in the seams, any chafe where the canvas met the rigging. Tools brought up for night use needed to be returned or properly stowed. If the ship carried guns, their condition was checked. The tampions that kept moisture from the muzzles, the condition of the lashings that secured the carriages when not in action. On a warship, weapons were part of the ship's readiness, and readiness was a daily maintenance question, not something that could be assessed only before battles. All of this collectively consumed the first hours after the night's last watch, and it was not done in silence. Orders moved down through a clear chain from the officer of the watch to the boatswain, the warrant officer responsible for rigging, anchors, and the deck crew, to the boatswain's mates, who were the immediate supervisors of the working sailors, and who carried their calls, the small metal whistles that pierced wind and shipboard noise alike, to signal commands that voices alone might not carry. A ship coming alive in the morning was a particular kind of coordinated noise familiar to everyone aboard, and probably audible to anyone close enough on the water to hear it. The point that deserves emphasis is this: the morning routine was not background activity. It was the mechanism by which the ship reasserted itself as a functioning, disciplined system after every passage through the night. Every line recoiled, every surface scrubbed, every piece of gear returned to its place was a small act of maintaining the ship's coherence, its readiness to sail, to fight, to survive. The men who performed these tasks often did them half asleep, cold, and resentful. But the tasks still had to be done, and the doing of them day after day without exception was itself the foundation of what it meant to run a ship at sea. All of that morning effort, the scrubbing, the inspection, the recoiling and restowing, was preparation for what the ship fundamentally existed to do: move. And movement aboard a sailing vessel was not a passive condition. The wind did not simply fill the sails and carry the ship forward while the crew watched. Every change in the wind's direction or force required a human response, sometimes a measured and deliberate one, and sometimes an immediate, all-hands scramble that left no one aboard uninvolved. Managing the sails was the central physical labour of life at sea, and understanding it goes a long way toward understanding why sailors were rarely idle. The vocabulary alone signals the complexity. Trimming a sail meant adjusting its angle relative to the wind, pulling in or easing out the lines, controlling its position so that the canvas caught the wind as efficiently as possible for the ship's desired course. This sounds simple in principle, and experienced sailors could trim a sail by feel and habit, reading the slight flutter along the leading edge of the canvas that told them it was on the edge of losing the wind, making tiny adjustments that collectively kept the ship moving at its best speed. But trim had to be maintained continuously. Wind was not constant. It shifted in direction by degrees, strengthened and eased, funneled differently as weather systems moved through, and every meaningful shift required someone to evaluate it and respond. On a large ship with multiple masts and dozens of individual sails, trimming was an ongoing and distributed task, never truly finished. Reefing was something different in character. It was reducing the sail area when the wind grew strong enough that carrying full canvas risked damage or loss of control. Each sail had horizontal lines of reef points sewn across it, short lengths of rope that hung in pairs. To reef the sail, sailors hauled up on lines called reef tackles to gather the lower portion of the sail upward, then went aloft to the yard, the horizontal spar from which the sail hung, and physically tied off the gathered canvas using those reef points, folding the excess fabric against the yard and securing it. This reduced the area of sail exposed to the wind, giving the ship more manageable power. As the wind continued to build, a second reef could be taken, and then a third. Shaking out a reef as the wind eased, releasing those ties, lowering the canvas back to its full extent, required the same coordinated effort in reverse. Furling a sail meant securing it entirely against the yard, removing it from service completely. A sail couldn't simply be dropped or left to hang. Loose canvas in wind could flog itself to destruction in minutes, and an unsecured sail was a genuine danger. Furling required sailors to go up onto the yard and gather the canvas by hand, rolling and folding it tightly against the spar, then passing the gaskets, short straps or lines around the bundle to hold it in place. Setting a sail was the reverse, removing the gaskets, releasing the canvas, and hauling it into position, using the appropriate running rigging. Each of these operations consumed real time and real physical effort, and on a square-rigged ship with 5 or 6 sails on a single mast and 3 or 4 masts in total, a full ship-wide sail change involved dozens of men working simultaneously on multiple simultaneous tasks. The danger of all this is easily underestimated. Working aloft on the yards put sailors at heights that, even on a modest-sized vessel, could place them 40, 60, or well over 100 feet above the water. They worked standing on foot ropes, thin lines suspended beneath the yard, leaning their bodies against the yard itself for balance, with both hands occupied on the canvas. The ship was moving beneath them, and the motion at that height was amplified significantly compared to the deck below. What felt like a manageable roll at the waterline became a sweeping arc aloft, throwing a man's weight forward against the spar, then jerking it back, while the wind worked on him directly. There were no safety harnesses in the modern sense. A fall from aloft typically meant death, either from the fall itself, or from hitting the deck or rigging below, or from going into the water in conditions where retrieving a man overboard was agonizingly difficult. And yet sailors went aloft routinely, in daylight and darkness, in calm conditions and in building storms, because the sails didn't wait for good weather to need attention. Some of the most demanding aloft work happened precisely when conditions were worst, when a storm required a sail to be furled, and the canvas was stiff with wet and fighting against every attempt to control it, when the yard was slick and the footrope was slippery and the wind was loud enough to swallow any voice trying to communicate across a dozen feet of air. Men died aloft. They fell in calm weather when fatigue made them careless, and they were swept away in storms when the sea made no allowances for human endurance. What made it survivable most of the time was teamwork. A sail operation was coordinated through a clear sequence of commands, passed from officer to boatswain to mates to the men on deck and aloft simultaneously. The men on deck controlled the lines, hauling, belaying, easing, while the men aloft handled the canvas directly. The timing had to be matched. If the deck crew eased the wrong line too soon, or the men aloft released the gaskets before the deck crew was ready, the consequences could range from a sail flogging itself to something much worse. This coordination was not instinctive. It was drilled into sailors through repetition until the sequence of actions became automatic, until each man knew not only his own task, but how it fitted into the movement of everyone around him. The difference between an experienced topman, a sailor assigned to the upper rigging and the most demanding aloft work, and a landsman newly pressed into service, was not merely a difference in confidence. It was a difference measured in survival. Landsmen and new recruits often didn't know which line to haul, couldn't read the sail's behaviour, and had no instinct for what a shifting wind required before an officer had to tell them. Experienced sailors anticipated. They watched the masthead pennant, read the darkening water that preceded a gust, felt changes in the ship's motion, and began moving toward their stations before the order fully arrived. That anticipatory knowledge, accumulated over years of repetition on multiple ships and in multiple conditions, was what distinguished the working sailor from someone simply occupying space on a ship. The wind could spend an entire watch perfectly steady, and the sails could spend that watch untouched. But no sailor trusted that to last. The sea had a long history of proving that a quiet afternoon was simply preparation for whatever came next. If the sails were the engine of the ship, the rigging was everything that made the engine run. Every sail depended on a network of ropes, blocks, spars, and fittings, and that network required constant attention, whether the weather was calm or closing fast. Seamanship was not simply the dramatic work of hauling lines in a squall or going aloft in darkness. Much of it was slower, quieter, and in some ways more demanding. The steady, skilled labour of maintaining a system that could not afford to fail. A ship of any real size carried miles of rope. That number is not an exaggeration offered for effect. A large frigate or ship of the line might have well over 30 miles of cordage in its rigging, divided broadly into two categories: standing rigging. The shrouds, stays, and backstays held the masts upright and in position. It was not meant to move during normal operations, but it wasn't passive either. It stretched under load, worked in heavy weather, chafed against spars and blocks and itself, and degraded steadily over time. Running rigging, the halyards, sheets, braces, lifts, and dozens of other named lines moved constantly, controlling the sails and yards. Both kinds demanded inspection and maintenance as a regular part of every working day. The skilled sailor understood rope in a way that is difficult to convey to anyone who hasn't spent time depending on it. Rope was not simply rope. It had a working life that could be read by someone who knew what to look for: the subtle fuzzing of fibres under friction, the stiffening of a line that had been repeatedly wet and dried under tension, the internal deterioration that could leave a line looking sound on the outside while it was failing within. Part of seamanship was knowing how to assess what you were looking at, and knowing how wrong a confident misjudgment could go. Splicing was one of the fundamental skills, where a modern solution might use a mechanical fitting or simply tie a knot. Sailors spliced, interlacing the individual strands of two rope ends together so that the join became part of the rope itself. Strong and smooth and capable of running through a block without snagging. A well-made eye splice, forming a loop at the end of a line, might retain close to the full strength of the original rope. A poor splice, or one made by someone still learning, could fail well below the line's rated load. Learning to splice properly meant hours of practice on scrap rope before the skill was trusted on working rigging, and skilled riggers could execute splices quickly and reliably under conditions that would make the work genuinely difficult. Cold, wet, fingers stiff, motion beneath them, someone waiting on the result. Serving rope was another layer of this knowledge. Exposed sections of rigging, particularly where lines ran through blocks or over spars, were wrapped tightly with a thinner line to protect the underlying strands from chafe. The process followed a specific sequence: worming, parcelling, and serving, that filled the lay of the rope, covered it with strips of tarred canvas, and then wound the small stuff binding tightly over everything. It was time-consuming, unglamorous work, but its purpose was preservation. A section of rigging left unprotected against chafe could wear through surprisingly quickly under the constant grinding of everyday operation, and a parted stay at the wrong moment could bring down a mast. Coiling was simpler in concept, but unforgiving in execution. Every line on deck had to be coiled in a specific way and stowed in a specific place so that it could run freely at a moment's notice without kinking, snarling, or fouling around anything it shouldn't. A rope coiled against its natural lay would spring into tangles the moment it was thrown clear. A line coiled correctly would run cleanly from the pile with nothing to slow it. In an emergency, a squall requiring an instant response, a man overboard requiring a line thrown immediately, a coil that ran free was the difference between a functional crew and a panicking one. Sailors coiled their lines correctly because that habit had been impressed on them through correction and repetition until it required no conscious thought. Neglected rigging was not simply an inconvenience. It was a genuine threat to the voyage, and history offered plentiful evidence. A shroud that parted under load could pull a mast out of the ship, and with a mast went the yards, the sails, often substantial sections of rigging attached to other masts, and potentially men who had been aloft. A block whose sheave had seized and was no longer turning freely would allow the rope running through it to be cut by friction rather than controlled. A halyard, showing internal wear, that had gone uninspected might fail, while hoisting a heavy yard, sending it crashing down onto whatever or whoever was below. The sea enforced its own standards of maintenance, and the standards were not negotiable. This is part of what made seamanship a genuine expertise and not simply a collection of physical tasks. The knowledge expected of a skilled seaman went well beyond being able to pull hard on a line when told to. An able seaman was expected to know the name and function of every significant piece of running and standing rigging on the ship, a practical requirement because orders were given using those names, and a man who didn't know which brace was being called for couldn't act on the order. He was expected to know which lines could be safely eased together and which would put the rig in conflict if handled simultaneously. He needed to understand load, which parts of the rigging were under tension, which were momentarily slack, and what would happen to both conditions if he acted on one without accounting for the other. This kind of knowledge lived in the body and the memory, rather than in any written form. Most sailors couldn't consult a reference. They carried what they knew in the accumulated experience of voyages, ships, rigs, and weathers, and that accumulated knowledge was what made an experienced seaman valuable in ways that couldn't easily be replaced. A landsman could be put to work hauling on a line immediately. It might take years before he understood enough of the system around him to anticipate what the system needed before someone had to tell him. Blocks, the wooden or metal pulleys through which lines ran to provide mechanical advantage, required their own regular attention, checking that their sheaves turned freely, that their shells showed no cracking, that their stropping was sound. D-dies, the carved wooden fittings used to tension the standing rigging, needed inspection and occasional adjustment. Shackles had to be pinned and seized, so they couldn't work open under vibration. Every fitting, every junction, every running surface in the rigging was a potential point of failure, and the ship's ability to make its destination depended on enough of those points holding together long enough to get there. The sailors who understood this, who could look at the rig and read its condition the way a musician reads a score, were the ones ships couldn't easily do without. The rigging was not the only system on a ship quietly working against failure. Below the waterline, something else was happening, something sailors dealt with every day, often without drama, but never without consequences if they ignored it. Ships leaked. Not all of them badly, and not all of them constantly, but enough, and often enough, that pumping the bilges was a routine task built into the ship's daily schedule, the way eating and sleeping were. The sea didn't wait to be invited in. It found its way through caulking that had dried and cracked, through seams that had worked open under the stress of heavy weather, through the countless small gaps and imperfections of a wooden hull that had been bending and flexing for months at sea. The bilge was the lowest interior space of the ship, where water naturally collected, both the seawater that seeped in and the runoff from rain, from wet decks, from condensation, from any source that could find its way down. Left unattended, that water rose. It rotted the ship's timbers from the inside. It contaminated the stores. In serious cases, it threatened the vessel itself. So sailors pumped. The ship's pumps, typically chain pumps on larger vessels which moved water efficiently but required sustained human effort, had to be operated regularly, sometimes twice a day as a matter of routine, and far more often when the ship was leaking badly or had been working hard in rough water. It was grinding, repetitive labour, unromantic by any measure, but entirely non-negotiable. A crew that neglected the pumps was a crew slowly surrendering their ship to the sea. What made the work interesting from a historical standpoint is what the pumping logs reveal about individual vessels. Some ships required only a few minutes of pumping each day to keep the water manageable. Others demanded hours. A new ship with fresh caulking might be relatively tight, but after a year or two of service, particularly if she had been driven hard in heavy weather, her hull would have worked considerably more. Older vessels, especially those that had been patched and repaired repeatedly, sometimes had bilges that required almost constant attention. Sailors joined a ship and learned quickly whether they were on a relatively tight vessel or one that kept them at the pumps. The difference mattered to their daily lives in a very direct way. Beyond pumping, routine maintenance of the hull and the ship's structure was ongoing work, not something deferred until reaching port. Caulking, the process of driving oakum into the seams between planks and sealing it with tar, could be done underway on the upper works, the portions of the hull above the waterline that could be reached from deck. Sections of deck planking that had opened could be recaulked. Fittings that had loosened could be reset. Spars that had developed cracks could be fished, a technique that involved binding additional timber alongside the damaged section to reinforce it and restore enough strength to remain in service. A fished spar was not a permanent repair, and no experienced officer would have pretended otherwise, but it was the difference between having a working mast and not having one while 3,000 miles from the nearest shipyard. Sail repair fell into this same category of ongoing improvisational maintenance. Sails tore. Storms tore them dramatically, but ordinary use wore them too, particularly at the points where they rubbed against rigging, at reef points under repeated stress, along the bolt ropes that supported their edges. The sailmaker and his mates on well-staffed ships, at dedicated rate, on smaller vessels, simply whoever had the skill, worked with heavy canvas and needles built for forcing thread through material that would defeat anything lighter. A sail brought below for serious repair might take days of work, but smaller damages were addressed quickly, sometimes even while the sail remained set, because leaving a small tier to work under wind pressure was a reliable invitation to a much larger one. What strikes modern readers about all of this is how much it depended on improvisation. A ship at sea in the mid-ocean had what it carried and nothing more. There was no resupply, no hardware merchant, no spare part ordered and delivered in 3 days. Sailors and officers solved problems with rope, timber, canvas, tar, and whatever else was aboard, working from experience and ingenuity in combinations that were not always recorded anywhere. A broken tiller could be replaced with a jury rig that allowed steering, however awkwardly. A sprung bowsprit could be supported with improvised stays. A section of badly damaged hull planking could sometimes be addressed with a futhering sail. A sail dragged under the hull and allowed to be sucked against the leak by water pressure, reducing the ingress enough to buy time. These were not elegant solutions. They were the solutions available, and the ability to devise them was a genuine marker of seamanship at its more demanding levels. The relationship between small problems and disasters was one that experienced sailors understood in their bones. The sea had a way of converting the unaddressed minor issue into the catastrophic emergency. A small chafe on a spar left uninspected became a split. A split left unrepaired became a failure at the wrong moment, in the wrong weather. With a loaded ship in a dangerous position, became something no one walked away from easily. The experienced crew didn't wait to see which small problems would escalate. They addressed them continuously, not because they feared immediate catastrophe, but because they understood the trajectory. Maintenance was not reactive, or not only reactive. It was the constant, unglamorous work of keeping the trajectory from running away. Weather damage accelerated everything. After a hard blow, the crew turned to assess what the storm had done, and began working through the list. A sprung yard needed immediate attention before it was asked to carry sail again. Rigging that had been set up before the storm might now be slack or dangerously over-tightened, depending on how the masts had worked. Running rigging that had been flogged by wind for hours needed inspection for chafe damage that the violence of the storm would have driven deep into the line's fibres. Deck fittings that had been under unusual stress needed to be checked. None of this waited until the sea was calm. Calm was when the repairs got done most easily, but any window of manageable weather was a working window. The sea, in the view of the sailors who lived on it, was not a passive environment. It pressed constantly against the ship, working at every joint, every seam, every fitting and fastening. The ship was a human answer to that pressure, and maintaining it was the ongoing argument that the crew was making against the sea's indifference. There was no final victory in that argument. There was only the daily work of staying ahead of it, pumping, patching, splicing, caulking, rigging improvised repairs, and getting underway again, because the sea wasn't finished and neither were they. While ordinary sailors were fighting the ship's physical systems, the pumps, the rigging, the sails, the constant contest against material failure, a different kind of contest was being waged in the chart room and on the quarterdeck. Officers faced a problem that was in some ways harder to solve than any leaking seam. They had to know, with confidence sufficient to act on, where they were. On a featureless ocean, with no landmarks, no road signs, and no margin for catastrophic error. The work of navigation was as serious as any labour being done below or aloft. It was just invisible to most of the men doing the physical work, and that invisibility sometimes bred the assumption that officers weren't doing much at all. They were. The nature of what they were doing simply looked different. Navigation in the age of sail depended on a combination of techniques, instruments, and accumulated judgment, none of which was foolproof, and each of which required daily attention. The most widely practiced method was dead reckoning, the practice of tracking a ship's position by starting from a known point, then calculating forward based on the ship's speed, heading, and elapsed time. It sounds straightforward. In practice, it accumulated error with every passing hour. Currents pushed a ship off its intended track. Wind made steering imprecise. Speed estimates from the logline. A device that trailed behind the ship and measured distance travelled through the water, not over the ground, could not account for current drift. Each day's reckoning built on the last, which meant errors compounded. A navigator who was 20 miles off his reckoned position after 1 week might be considerably further off after 3 weeks, and a ship's track through an ocean, with no reference points, had a way of making errors patient, before revealing them suddenly and catastrophically near a coastline. Latitude was more certain, and taking a noon sight was one of the fixed rituals of a ship's day, an event that organised the officer's schedule around the moment when the sun reached its highest point in the sky. The process involved measuring the sun's altitude above the horizon with a quadrant, or, by the later 18th century, a sextant, then comparing it against published tables to calculate the ship's latitude. On a clear day, this was reliable and reproducible. But cloudy days denied the observation entirely, multiple overcast days in a row left the navigator working purely from dead reckoning, which was precisely when the accumulated errors became most consequential. Skilled navigators developed a feel for how much they could trust their own reckoning after days without a sight, and that feel was built from years of experience, which is to say it was judgment rather than certainty, and honest navigators knew the difference. Longitude remained a genuinely unsolved problem for much of naval history. Without an accurate marine chronometer, which only became reliably available in the latter half of the 18th century, a navigator's longitude was an estimate arrived at through dead reckoning lunar observations or informed approximation. Even after chronometers became standard, officers still had to maintain them carefully, check their rates against celestial observations when possible, and account for the accumulated error of a long passage. The history of ships wrecked on coasts they thought were safely distant is, in large part, a history of longitude failing at the worst possible moment. The captain and the ship's master, who in many naval traditions was the officer specifically responsible for navigation, distinct from the commanding captain, would compare their calculations, discuss discrepancies, and make decisions together. On merchant vessels, the captain was typically his own navigator. On warships, the structure was more complex, with the master holding specialized authority over navigation and pilotage, while the captain held overall command. The mates, depending on their certification and experience, shared in the navigational work, keeping their own logs, working their own sights, and developing the skills that would eventually qualify them for more senior positions. Command was not only navigation, though the captain's day was layered with responsibilities that would be recognizable to any modern manager burdened with administration, except that the consequences of poor decisions were measured not in quarterly results, but in lives and ships. Course decisions were made constantly, whether to bear away from the direct route to avoid a suspected shoal, whether to press on through deteriorating weather or heave to and wait it out, whether the wind shift demanded an immediate change to the sail plan or could be accommodated with minor adjustments. These decisions required the captain to synthesize information from multiple sources simultaneously: the feel of the ship underfoot, the state of the weather, the reports from the officer of the watch, the known positions of hazards on the chart, and the condition of the crew and vessel after days or weeks at sea. Paperwork was genuine and unavoidable. Ships were systems of documentation as much as timber and canvas. The logbook was the ship's legal and navigational record, maintained with the day's course, speed, weather observations, incidents, and navigational data. Letters to the ship's owners or the Admiralty accumulated when there was opportunity to send them. Crew rosters, sick lists, disciplinary records, stores accounts, and provisions tallies all required attention. The purser handled much of the financial accounting, but officers reviewed, signed, and were accountable for what was recorded under their authority. None of this was the dramatic stuff of sea fiction, but failing to keep accurate records had real consequences. In prize money disputes, in courts-martial, in accusations of negligence or fraud. The mates and lieutenants served as the captain's extended command structure, each responsible for a watch for the men in their division, and for the smooth running of their assigned responsibilities during their time on deck. A first lieutenant on a naval vessel managed the daily routine of the ship, supervised the work of the crew, maintained the watch schedule, and served as the intermediary between the men and the captain. The relationship between a competent first lieutenant and a captain was among the most important variables in a ship's efficiency. A bad fit between them could degrade an entire ship's performance, as the historical record repeatedly suggests. What sailors in the forecastle rarely saw was the mental load carried on the quarterdeck, the constant calculation of risk, the integration of imperfect information, the responsibility for decisions whose full consequences might not appear for hours or days. A captain who ordered a course change based on a weather reading that proved correct had done something valuable and invisible. One who misjudged and put his ship on a lee shore in a rising gale had done something visible indeed, but by then it was too late for the lesson to be comfortable. Command at sea rewarded foresight and punished its absence without sympathy, and the officers who lasted in the profession understood that their real work happened in the space between the available information and the decision that information demanded. That space, narrow and often poorly lit, was where they lived their professional lives. All that calculation and command on the quarterdeck was ultimately in service of keeping a ship moving and its crew functioning, and a crew that wasn't fed, or that was fed badly enough, for long enough, stopped functioning with remarkable speed. The question of how you provision, prepare, and distribute food for dozens or hundreds of men across weeks or months at sea was not a secondary concern. It was essential to a voyage's success as navigation, and in some periods of history it probably killed more sailors than storms did. What sailors ate on long voyages was shaped almost entirely by what wouldn't rot, what could be stored in bulk, and what the ship's budget allowed. The staples were unglamorous by any standard. Hardtack, ship's biscuit, was the foundation of most sailors' diets in the age of sail, dried, dense, and nearly indestructible under ideal storage conditions. Biscuit could technically last for months or even years. The problem was that ideal storage conditions were almost never achieved aboard a working ship. Moisture got in, weevils got in tropical climates especially. Biscuit that had been loaded in good condition could become something considerably less appetizing within weeks, riddled with insect larvae, soft with damp, or spotted with mold. Experienced sailors had their own solutions, most of which involved eating the biscuit in dim light, tapping it sharply on a hard surface before eating to dislodge what lived inside it, or simply accepting that the protein moving around their food was additional protein, rather than a reason to complain. Salted beef and salt pork were the other cornerstones of the sailor's ration, packed into barrels with enough salt to preserve them for long periods. Like hardtack, the preservation worked in principle better than it often did in practice. Barrels could fail. Salt concentrations varied after months in a ship's hold in tropical heat. Salt meat sometimes arrived at the cook's station in a state that made strong men question their choices. When it was good, it was still tough and intensely salty, typically boiled into edibility rather than prepared in any way that modern palates would recognize as cooking. Other preserved provisions varied by national tradition, historical period, and what the purser had managed to procure. Dried peas were common and important. As a source of something approaching nutrition, oatmeal or burgoo appeared on some ships as a morning staple. Cheese and butter were loaded when available and edible for as long as they held, and dried or pickled fish appeared in various combinations depending on the voyage's origin and destination. The cook responsible for transforming these materials into meals was not, in most historical contexts, a skilled culinary professional. On Royal Navy vessels, the cook's position was often assigned to men who had been partially disabled in service, men with lost limbs or other injuries that prevented them from doing the heavy physical work of seamanship. It was a form of continued employment and recognition rather than a posting, based on demonstrated cooking talent. The tools available were limited to a large brick-built or iron firebox called the caboose or galley stove, capable of boiling large quantities of food but not much else in terms of technique. Baking, roasting, or anything requiring precise heat control was largely beyond what the ship's cook could practically accomplish. Boiling was the method. The cook boiled the meat, boiled the peas, boiled whatever was being consumed that day, and the crew ate what emerged. Meals were typically served twice a day, with a midday dinner being the main event, and a lighter supper in the evening. Men ate in messes, small groups, often of 6 to 8 men, who shared food from common dishes and ate together at a designated spot between the guns or at tables slung from the beams. The mess system was practically important for distributing food equitably, but it also became socially significant. Messes developed their own internal cultures, hierarchies, and habits. A good mess with compatible men could make the monotony of shipboard eating tolerable. A fractious mess could add social misery to the dietary misery already being endured. Rationing was a constant backdrop to all of it. Rations were calculated based on the expected length of the voyage, adjusted as the voyage extended or the provisions degraded, and managed by the purser, a figure who was often viewed with suspicion by the crew because he sat at the intersection of institutional allocation and individual portions. Short waits, substitutions, and the purser's legal right in some navies to profit from remaining stores all made the purser's relationship with the crew a complicated one. When rations were cut, the announcement landed hard on men who were already eating monotonous and sometimes unpleasant food and working physically demanding hours. The connection between adequate food and crew morale was understood intuitively by experienced captains, even if the nutritional science behind it was entirely absent from their vocabulary. Water was, if anything, more carefully managed than food. A ship carrying hundreds of men needed enormous quantities of fresh water, stored in wooden casks that were themselves a source of problems. Wood absorbed flavours and organisms. Water stored for weeks in a tropical hold could develop an extraordinary variety of unpleasant characteristics, colour, odour, and biological activity among them. The standard response was to mix it with alcohol, beer, wine, or spirits depending on the era and the national tradition. The British Navy's practice of issuing grog, a mixture of rum and water, became famous, partly because it genuinely solved a problem. Alcohol inhibited the biological activity that made old water actively dangerous, and a predictable daily ration of something mildly alcoholic served simultaneously as a preservative, a morale tool, and a disciplinary laver. Withholding grog was punishment. Issuing an extra tot was reward. The simplicity of that system appealed to naval administrators and to the men alike. Replenishing both water and food was a driver of navigational decisions that might otherwise seem puzzling. Ships did not always take the geometrically shortest route between 2 points. They took routes that allowed them to call at ports or anchorages where provisions could be refreshed, water casks refilled, and livestock taken on board for fresh meat, livestock that would be slaughtered progressively over the voyage's early weeks. The presence of animals on deck was common on longer voyages, with chickens, pigs, and goats crowding into whatever space was available. Their gradual disappearance from the ship's population as the voyage continued was a physical marker of the passage of time and the lengthening distance from port. What all of this amounts to is that eating aboard ship was labour-intensive, logistically complex, and almost never pleasant by the standards of what the same men would have eaten ashore. But it was also deeply routine, deeply social, and deeply embedded in the daily structure of life at sea. The timing of meals organised the day. The mess group created community. The quality of food, or the lack of it, shaped the emotional temperature of the entire crew in ways that officers who understood their work took seriously. A ship that fed its men adequately, even if monotonously, was a ship that held together. One that didn't was a ship that was already starting to fail, even before the weather turned. If feeding the crew was a logistical challenge that shaped every other aspect of the voyage, sleeping was something close to a philosophical one. The men who built and operated sailing ships understood that a crew needed rest to function. They also built and operated vessels where genuine rest was, for most of the people aboard, structurally nearly impossible. The tension between those two facts played out every single night, in every watch rotation, across every voyage. For common sailors, the ordinary and able seamen who made up the bulk of any crew, sleeping quarters were not quarters in any meaningful sense of the word. They slept where they could be put, in whatever space the ship's cargo, guns, stores, and working machinery had not already claimed, on larger warships and merchant vessels. This typically meant the lower gun deck or the orlop deck. The spaces between and around the guns, the beams overhead hung with hammocks that, when occupied and swinging, left only a narrow channel for men to pass through. The hammock itself was a genuine innovation when it arrived in European seafaring, adopted from indigenous Caribbean peoples and recognized almost immediately as a practical solution to the problem of sleeping on a moving platform. A hammock, properly slung, moves with the ship rather than fighting it. A man sleeping in one is, in theory, cradled by the same motion that would otherwise throw him off a fixed bunk. In rough seas, the hammock's gentle, self-correcting swing was genuinely superior to any fixed sleeping surface. In practice, the advantages were real, but the comfort was limited. Each man was typically allotted around 14 inches of horizontal space, a width that reflected the number of bodies that needed to fit into the available hanging points rather than any consideration for human comfort. Hammocks were slung so close together that a man could reach out and touch the sleeper on either side. Privacy was non-existent. The man above you was inches from your face. The man below, there was no man below. Because the hammock swung freely, but the deck was close, and a hammock that was improperly slung, or that its occupant had not learned to settle into correctly, could deposit its sleeper onto planking with very little warning. Bedding was whatever the sailor owned or had been issued, typically a blanket or two, sometimes a straw-stuffed mattress rolled into the hammock or stuffed inside it, constituting what regulations and inventories called a bed, in a somewhat aspirational use of the term. The hammock itself was made of canvas, which had the advantage of durability and the disadvantage of absorbing moisture readily. A ship at sea is a wet environment, in ways that never entirely stop being surprising to those who haven't experienced it. Spray comes over the bow and finds its way below. Condensation forms on every cold surface and drips. Men come below off watch, soaking from rain or wave action, and squeeze into a space that is also trying to sleep. The result was that hammocks, bedding, and the men inside them were frequently damp, and in cold climates, damp became a chronic companion that contributed to the respiratory illness that the following section will explore in more detail. In tropical climates, the dampness was warm, which resolved the cold but introduced its own suite of unpleasantness. Officers slept in an entirely different world, which is worth understanding not to romanticize it, but because the contrast illuminates how completely a man's rank determined his physical experience of the same voyage. A captain had a cabin at the stern, the most prestigious and least miserable sleeping space on the ship, with windows, relative quiet relative to the gun deck, and enough room to stand up and move around. Senior officers had individual cabins, small ones, but private and fixed. Junior officers shared accommodations, but still had cots rather than hammocks, partitioned spaces rather than open decks, and at least the theoretical possibility of closing a door. Midshipmen, who occupied an awkward social space between officer and crew, often lived in conditions closer to the lower deck than to the captain's cabin, crowded into a designated mess area and sleeping in cots or, on smaller vessels, hammocks of their own. Specialists like the carpenter, boatswain and gunner typically had small cabins near the spaces they were responsible for, the carpenter near the ship's stores, the gunner near the magazine, which gave them a degree of privacy, but also a degree of constant proximity to their work. None of this, however, addresses what was perhaps the most significant source of exhaustion aboard any vessel, the watch system itself. Sleep for a common sailor was never a continuous block of hours. The 4-hour watch rotation meant that a man worked 4 hours, then theoretically had 4 hours off, then returned to work. 8 hours of potential rest broken into 2 4-hour segments, neither of which was guaranteed to be peaceful, both of which could be interrupted instantly by a change in weather or an order from above. The dog watches. Those 2-hour shortened watches in the late afternoon, designed to rotate who stood which watch each day, added further fragmentation. The practical result was that most sailors lived in a state of chronic partial sleep deprivation that was simply accepted as a condition of the work. Going below for your off-watch rest meant descending into a space that was simultaneously occupied by men trying to sleep and men moving through to reach other parts of the ship. The gun deck was not silent when the guns were not being worked. It was a space of continuous background noise, the creaking of the hull, which on a wooden ship under sail is constant and frequently loud, the sounds of water against the planking, The movement of men, the occasional crash of something shifting in heavy weather, and the ambient sounds of dozens of people packed into close proximity. Men slept through this because they had to, because the alternative was not sleeping at all, and because the human body will eventually claim rest, even in extraordinary conditions. But the sleep they got was rarely what any physiologist would recognize as restorative in any complete sense. The cumulative weight of this fatigue was not merely uncomfortable, it was operationally dangerous. Exhausted men make mistakes with lines under tension. Exhausted men on watch in bad weather miss changes in the sky that a rested man would catch earlier. Exhausted men working aloft, already exposed to the most unforgiving environment the ship offered, move with less precision and react with less speed. The historical record contains enough accounts of accidents during watches in the late night and early morning hours, the period when human alertness naturally bottoms out, to suggest that the connection between interrupted sleep and catastrophic error was something experienced officers understood implicitly, even without the language of modern sleep science to describe it. What sailors developed over time and out of necessity was a capacity for fractured rest that became a kind of professional adaptation, the ability to fall asleep quickly, in any position, in any noise environment, and to wake fully alert when required. These were skills as real as splicing rope or reading a compass. Exhaustion was not exceptional, it was the baseline, and enduring it, day after day, week after week, while continuing to function with competence and without completely breaking down, was one of the most underappreciated demands of the sailor's ordinary life. A crew running on fractured sleep and rationed food, confined to a wooden hull for months with no possibility of escape, was not a crew that could be held together by goodwill alone. The discipline systems that governed life aboard ship were not incidental to seafaring. They were load-bearing. Without them, in the judgment of officers, naval administrators, and experienced captains across multiple centuries, the entire enterprise collapsed. Whether that judgment was always correct is worth questioning. That the systems themselves were real, pervasive, and consequential is not. The logic behind strict discipline on ships drew from several sources, some practical and some self-serving. The practical case was straightforward. A vessel at sea is an environment where individual failures cascade. A sailor who fails to respond promptly to an order during a sudden squall doesn't just inconvenience the ship, he potentially creates a situation where other men die. A man who falls asleep on watch during fog navigation puts everyone aboard at risk. A crewman who hoards water in a shortage threatens the survival calculus of the entire voyage. The interconnectedness of shipboard life meant that individual behaviour had collective consequences in ways that most shore-bound work did not. Officers used this reality, often correctly, to justify a degree of behavioural control over sailors that would have been unthinkable in any other employment of the era. The offences that drew formal punishment covered a wide spectrum. At the severe end were mutiny, desertion, striking an officer, and sleeping on watch, the last of which, given what we've already established about how desperately men wanted sleep, was both predictable and genuinely dangerous. Below those sat a long catalogue of lesser infractions: drunkenness, insubordination, fighting below decks, theft from shipmates, failure to appear for watch, negligence with the ship's stores or equipment, and the catch-all charge of contempt or disrespectful behaviour toward superiors. In naval services with formal written codes, the British Royal Navy's Articles of War being among the most well-documented, these offences and their prescribed responses were specified in sometimes meticulous detail. Merchant vessels operated with considerably more variability, depending on the vessel's flag nation, the trade it was in, and the personality of whoever held command. Punishment itself took several forms. The one that has received the most historical attention is flogging, the application of a cat o' nine tails to a man's bare back, administered in front of the assembled crew, with the number of lashes determined by the captain's judgment or formal court-martial finding. Flogging was common in the Royal Navy through the late 18th and well into the 19th century, and it appears in enough memoirs, logs, and administrative records to be treated as a genuine and frequent feature of naval life, rather than an exceptional one. It was also used, with varying regularity, in other navies and in some merchant services. What's harder to determine with precision is how universal the experience was, since flogging rates varied significantly between ships and between captains. Some commanders used it frequently, and for minor infractions. Others reserved it only for serious offences or avoided it largely on principle. The record suggests that individual command style mattered enormously. Beyond formal flogging, officers and petty officers had access to a range of informal corrective measures, running the gauntlet, where a man walked between two lines of shipmates who struck him, appears in earlier accounts and various national traditions. Confinement in the ship's brig or in irons was available on larger vessels. Extra duties, loss of grog rations, denial of shore leave when in port, assignment to the most unpleasant tasks. These were tools available to any officer who wanted to make a man's life more difficult without resorting to formal proceedings. At the petty officer level, enforcement was often more immediate and physical in ways that never made it into official records. Bosuns and their mates carried a rope's end called a starter, exactly what it sounds like, and used it to hurry men along or to administer quick, unofficial correction that fell below the threshold of a formal punishment entry in the ship's log. What held the system together, though, wasn't purely fear of punishment. 3 other forces worked alongside formal enforcement and arguably outweighed it in most day-to-day operations. The first was routine itself, a crew that is kept busy, and as earlier sections of this discussion have made clear, sailors were kept very busy, has less time and energy for the kind of idleness, resentment, and group grievance that tips into open defiance. Experienced commanders knew that an idle crew was a dangerous one, and the relentless cycle of maintenance, watch standing, cleaning, and drill was not entirely unconnected to its effect on crew management. The second force was dependence. Sailors depended on one another for physical survival in ways that created their own disciplinary gravity. A man who was genuinely disruptive, who endangered his shipmates through carelessness or malice, faced not just official punishment, but the informal withdrawal of goodwill from the very people he lived and worked alongside in claustrophobic proximity. Shipboard social cohesion was its own regulatory mechanism, and in many accounts it appears to have been at least as powerful as anything the captain could administer. The third force was the captain's authority, which on many vessels was genuinely vast and only lightly checked. At sea, far from any court or administrator, a captain's word was effectively law within limits that were legally defined but practically difficult to contest in real time. This could create conditions of extraordinary abuse. The historical record contains enough documented cases of tyrannical captains to confirm that the power was sometimes used viciously and without legitimate justification. It could also create conditions of genuine paternalism, where a capable, fair-minded commander used his authority to protect men from arbitrary punishment and to build something closer to functional respect than raw fear. The variation between naval and merchant service is worth noting explicitly. Naval discipline in most major seafaring nations was formally codified and applied within an institutional structure that, however imperfect, at least theoretically constrained individual captains. Merchant service was looser, less regulated, and more dependent on individual personality and contractual arrangements that varied by voyage, route, and employer. A sailor moving between naval and merchant service, as many did, might find themselves subject to radically different disciplinary environments, and their experience of shipboard discipline would reflect that movement. What remains across all these variations is a recognizable tension, a workplace where control was considered essential, where the tools of that control ranged from institutional fairness to outright brutality, and where the men subject to it had very limited formal recourse, but were never entirely without power, since a crew ultimately was the thing that made the ship move. The ship that discipline held together was also a ship that could make you sick, infect your wounds, rot your gums, and leave you scratching at your skin for weeks before you ever saw a port. Shipboard illness was not an occasional disaster that punctuated otherwise tolerable conditions. For many sailors, in many periods, it was the background texture of existence, a low-level constant that shaded everything else about life at sea. The physical environment of a sailing vessel was almost purpose-built to undermine human health. Below decks, where most of the crew lived, light was limited, and fresh air was a managed resource rather than a given. Ventilation systems on larger naval ships improved somewhat over the 18th century. Windsails, gratings, and other attempts to push air into the lower decks became more common. But the fundamental reality of dozens or hundreds of men sharing a confined, damp, poorly lit space remained. Wet clothing dried slowly, if it dried at all. Hammocks were slung close together, which made nighttime temperatures survivable in cold climates, but turned the lower deck into something close to a fever incubator when disease arrived. The ship moved constantly, which meant that any bodily fluid, sweat, vomit, blood, bilge water working its way through the hull, was never entirely still for long. Sanitation arrangements were minimal by any standard that would be recognizable today. Sailors used the ship's heads, the forward area of the vessel near the bowsprit, as their latrine, and in good weather this worked tolerably because the wind and wave action provided some natural flushing. In bad weather, or for men who were already sick, making that journey forward was not always possible, and the results distributed themselves accordingly. The bilges, the lowest internal spaces of the ship where water collected, accumulated a mixture of seawater, cargo leakage, animal waste if livestock were carried, rotting material, and organic debris that, in warm weather especially, produced a smell that appears in account after account as one of the defining sensory experiences of shipboard life. Newcomers to sea found it overwhelming. Veterans apparently stopped noticing it, or at least stopped complaining in writing. Vermin were a permanent presence. Rats were not an occasional inconvenience, but a structural feature of wooden ships, living in the holds, eating into provisions, contaminating water casks, and moving freely through spaces where men slept and ate. Lice were nearly universal in the lower decks, and difficult to eliminate in conditions where changing and washing clothing was already constrained by water rationing. Fleas, cockroaches, and weevils in the bread, the last so common that they appear in sailors' accounts, almost as a culinary footnote rather than an outrage, completed a picture of cohabitation with small creatures that was simply accepted as part of what the sea involved. Skin problems thrived in these conditions. Constant dampness, salt exposure, rough clothing, and inability to wash properly meant that rashes, sores, chafing, and fungal infections were common chronic complaints rather than acute emergencies. Salt water regularly worked into cuts and abrasions, from the constant physical labour of handling rope and rigging, keeping wounds open and prone to infection, at a time when the mechanisms of infection were not understood and the treatments available were largely ineffective. Of the more serious illnesses, scurvy is the one that has received the most historical attention, and for good reason. Caused by vitamin C deficiency, it produced progressive deterioration, fatigue and joint pain in early stages, swollen and bleeding gums, reopening of old wounds, and eventually death on voyages long enough to exhaust whatever fresh provisions a crew started with. The connection between diet and scurvy was suspected by some practitioners well before it was formally established, and various practical remedies, citrus juice, sauerkraut, fresh provisions taken on wherever possible, were tried with varying institutional support across different navies and eras. The British Royal Navy's eventual commitment to lemon juice rations in the 1790s is often cited as a genuine public health advance, though it came after generations of unnecessary deaths on long voyages. The point is that for much of the age of sail, scurvy was not a theoretical risk, but a routine one on extended passages. Typhus, dysentery, yellow fever, and malaria All took enormous tolls depending on where a ship operated. Tropical stations were understood to be genuinely deadly assignments, particularly for European crews with no prior exposure to diseases endemic to those regions. Fleet actions in the Caribbean or West African coasts often killed more men to fever than to enemy action, a fact that commanders and naval administrators were well aware of and largely unable to solve with the tools available to them. The practice of quarantine, keeping newly arrived ships isolated before allowing crew ashore, was an attempt to manage this problem and suggests that the link between human contact and disease transmission was understood in practical terms, even when the biology was not. Shipboard surgeons, where they existed, worked within severe constraints. A naval vessel of sufficient size would carry a surgeon and possibly surgeons' mates, trained to varying degrees and equipped with a chest of instruments and medications whose efficacy ranged from genuinely useful to actively harmful. Amputation was the primary intervention for badly injured limbs, and surgeons with real experience could perform it with reasonable speed mattering enormously in an era before anesthesia when shock was a primary killer. Smaller vessels and most merchant ships might carry no trained medical personnel at all, leaving improvised care to the captain or a crewmate with some practical experience. What surgeons could not do was treat most infections effectively, address the nutritional deficiencies behind scurvy until dietary intervention was available, or stop the spread of contagious illness through a crew living in close quarters. They could set bones, dress wounds, lance abscesses, and administer the pharmacological options of their era, various preparations of mercury, opium, and plant-based remedies, with unpredictable results. For men with serious internal injuries, untreatable infections, or advanced disease, the ship's surgeon was often present not as a source of effective treatment, but as a witness to deterioration. What all of this meant in practice was that a sailor's relationship with physical suffering was not one of crisis management, but of ongoing negotiation. Most of the discomforts described here, the dampness, the vermin, the skin problems, the low-level illness, the chronic ache in joints worked hard in wet cold, were not emergencies. They were the ordinary texture of the job. A sailor who could not endure minor suffering at a continuous, relentless level was not going to last at sea, and the men who did last developed, by necessity, a tolerance for physical hardship that comes across in their accounts as something between stoicism and resignation. That tolerance was not indifference. The letters, memoirs, and court testimonies of sailors who recorded their experiences make clear that men noticed, complained, suffered, and in some cases were permanently damaged by conditions that were presented to them as simply what seafaring involved. The discipline that held crews together, as the previous discussion established, operated on people who were also wet, hungry, itching, sick with some regularity, and sleeping in rotation beside men who were sick more. The ordinary misery of life at sea was not the dramatic suffering of storms and battles. It was quieter, more persistent, and in many ways harder to metabolize because it was never entirely resolved, just endured, voyage after voyage, until a man's sea career ended one way or another. Against all that accumulated physical misery, the damp, the itch, the gnawing hunger, the chronic exhaustion, there was something that might seem almost impossible to reconcile with the picture just described: time. Not much of it, and never entirely free of obligation, but time nonetheless. Because for all the genuine labour involved in running a ship, the sea itself imposed long stretches of relative quiet that no amount of dutiful seamanship could fill. Calm days, steady trades, uneventful mid-ocean passages. These were not the dramatic set pieces of maritime history, but they occupied enormous portions of any voyage, and what men did during them matters as much to understanding life at sea as anything that happened when the weather turned. The idea that sailors were perpetually labouring every waking moment is a kind of myth, just as the opposing fantasy of swashbuckling adventure around every headland belongs to the same romanticised tradition. Reality sat somewhere between the two. When the wind was steady, the sails were trimmed, the rigging was sound, and no immediate task demanded the whole crew's attention. Men off watch had hours that were, in theory at least, their own. What they did with those hours reveals something important about how human beings manage confinement, monotony, and the particular psychological pressure of being surrounded by nothing but open water for weeks or months at a time. Music was probably the most socially cohesive of the informal activities available. The working songs, sea shanties, served a functional purpose during collective labour, as discussed in the context of sail handling. But music in leisure hours operated differently. A sailor who could play a fiddle, a fife, or even a simple tin whistle was a valued member of any crew, not just for entertainment, but for the social glue that music provided. Dancing on deck during the evening watch was common on many ships, when weather and command permitted, and the sight of sailors dancing, sometimes with each other, in the absence of any other option, sometimes in improvised performances for an audience, appears frequently enough in accounts of shipboard life to suggest it was a genuine feature of the culture rather than an exceptional event. Storytelling carried enormous weight in an oral culture where most men at sea had accumulated experiences genuinely worth recounting. Tales of other voyages, other ships, storms survived, ports visited, creatures spotted, captains endured. These circulated through crews and were refined through repetition into something closer to performance than simple conversation. Yarn spinning, as it was commonly described, was both entertainment and a form of informal history-keeping, a way of transmitting knowledge about the sea and its hazards through narrative rather than instruction. Gambling was nearly universal and nearly universally prohibited, which meant it happened anyway in corners and below decks where officers were unlikely to appear. Cards and dice were the primary instruments, and the stakes could range from trivial to genuinely alarming, men sometimes wagering future pay, clothing, or rations against one another, in games that could generate resentment and conflict long after the cards were put away. Naval regulations against gambling existed precisely because its consequences extended beyond the game itself, creating debts and grievances that destabilized the social order officers spent considerable effort maintaining. Craftwork occupied many sailors' hands during idle hours in a way that was practical, creative, and socially meaningful all at once. Rope work, knotting, splicing, braiding into decorative and functional objects was a natural extension of skills already mastered and could produce items of real utility or complexity. Scrimshaw, the engraving of whalebone or ivory with needle or knife, was particularly associated with whalers whose voyages could stretch to years and who had access to materials as a byproduct of their work. Model ships, carved from whatever wood was available, appear in historical records as both personal projects and gifts. The category of sailor-made objects is broad enough that it constitutes a recognizable tradition in material culture history, reflecting the intersection of enforced idleness, acquired skill, and the very human impulse to make something. Reading and writing, where literacy permitted, provided another avenue. Not all sailors could read, but literacy was more common among seamen than is sometimes assumed, particularly among officers and skilled specialists. A man who could read might work through a Bible or a navigational text borrowed from the ship's limited resources. Letter writing was common in naval contexts, with men composing correspondence that could not be sent until the next port, and that served as much as a form of self-narration as actual communication. Socialization, however, operated within structures that could not be entirely relaxed without consequence. The hierarchy of rank was not suspended during leisure time. Officers and common sailors did not generally share the same recreational spaces or activities, and the social geography of the ship, which assigned different decks and areas to different ranks, persisted even in idle hours. Within the lower deck, though, a genuine community formed, with friendships, alliances, and ongoing social dynamics that shaped the emotional texture of a voyage considerably. Boredom, when it shaded from tolerable to acute, became a real operational problem. Long calms and featureless passages produced a psychological state in which minor irritations grew into significant conflicts, old grievances resurfaced, and men who were managing difficult conditions adequately under normal circumstances began to deteriorate. Fights were more likely when there was nothing to do. Accidents involving carelessness, a man's attention drifting at a moment when it should not, became more frequent when routine had dulled attention for too long. And in the darkest cases, despair could accumulate into something more serious, particularly on voyages where the destination seemed impossibly remote and the return date was uncertain. Commanders who understood this, and many experienced officers did, made deliberate efforts to manage the morale problem that extended passages created. Ordering extra drills or work parties when there was no strict operational need for them was partly about readiness, but it was also partly about giving men something to do, something to focus on, something that structured the otherwise formless hours. The logic behind keeping a crew busy had a psychological dimension that sat alongside the practical one. What all of this amounts to is a picture of leisure at sea as something genuinely negotiated rather than simply enjoyed. Men found real pleasure in music, in games, in the making of things, in the telling of stories, in friendship forged under shared hardship. But that pleasure was always framed by constraint, the constraint of rank, of regulation, of physical space, of the lurking knowledge that a change in weather or a word from an officer could end the moment entirely. The freedom available in those hours was real but bounded, and the creativity with which sailors worked within those bounds says something honest about human adaptability. Boredom at sea was not merely an absence of stimulation. It was a pressure that the best crews, and the best individuals within them, learned to manage as deliberately as they managed anything else the sea threw at them. That deliberate effort to keep men occupied, drilling them when there was no immediate need, points towards something worth examining more carefully, because the drills themselves were not simply busy work dressed up in operational language. They were preparation for situations where failure to respond correctly and quickly could kill everyone aboard. The ship as workplace was also inescapably, the ship as training ground, and the work of preparing for emergencies that had not yet happened was one of the most consistent and consequential features of life at sea. The fundamental problem was timing. Emergencies at sea almost never announced themselves with sufficient warning to allow improvisation. A fire below decks, a sudden squall, a spar carried away in a gust, a collision, a cannon crew that had never worked under pressure. These scenarios had in common the fact that the moment they materialized, there was no time to explain what needed to be done or to figure out who should do it. The response had to be automatic, distributed across the whole crew simultaneously, executed without the luxury of thought. The only way to achieve that was repetition long before the crisis arrived. Naval vessels were considerably more formal about this than merchant ships, and the difference mattered in ways that went beyond institutional preference. A warship's fighting effectiveness depended on its gun crews operating at something approaching mechanical precision under conditions of smoke, noise, and incoming fire. The standard expectation in the Royal Navy by the late 18th century was that a gun crew should be able to load, run out, aim, and fire their piece within a specific time. Estimates and accounts vary, and individual ships and crews differed considerably, but the aspiration towards speed and coordination was consistent. Gun drill was accordingly a regular and serious exercise, conducted often enough that the sequence of actions became genuinely reflexive. Each man in the crew had a numbered position and a specific task, and the assignment of tasks to men, rather than leaving the sequence to informal negotiation, was itself a form of preparation, removing the moment of decision that in a real engagement would cost precious seconds. Beyond the guns, fire drill occupied a particular place in the hierarchy of shipboard anxieties. A wooden ship saturated with tar pitch, and the residue of years at sea, carrying gunpowder in its magazines and open flame in its cook stoves and lanterns, was combustible in a way that concentrated the mind considerably. Fire at sea was among the most feared emergencies, precisely because the options were so limited. A ship that could not be saved became a death trap, and men who had never practiced the response were likely to contribute to chaos rather than containment. Fire stations assigned specific crew members to specific tasks, manning the pumps, passing buckets, controlling the magazine, preparing boats. Knowing your station and moving to it immediately, without waiting for instruction, was the whole point, and that knowledge came only through rehearsal. Damage control in a broader sense received similar attention on well-run ships. A hull breach, a sprung plank, a mast threatening to go over the side, each had protocols that needed to be practiced. Sail handling drills, separate from the ordinary daily work of trimming and adjusting, pushed crews to reduce or change sail in simulated emergency conditions, reefing under time pressure, furling in deteriorating weather, handling a suddenly unmanageable yard. The best captains did not wait for a gale to discover how long it took their crew to shorten sail. They found out in advance, under controlled conditions, when the consequences of slowness were embarrassment rather than catastrophe. For inexperienced sailors, and every ship carried them, because voyages were crewed with whoever was available, willing or pressed, the training problem was more fundamental. A man new to the sea did not arrive with even the vocabulary of seamanship, let alone its practical competence. He learned through immersion, assigned to work alongside experienced men, corrected sharply when he made mistakes, given the same tasks repeatedly until his body learned what his mind was still processing. The correction was often neither gentle nor patient. Officers and petty officers on working ships operated under conditions that did not easily accommodate extended pedagogical care, and a new hand who fumbled a critical rope at a bad moment was likely to receive instruction in the form that came most naturally under stress, which was rarely calm. This was harsh, but the sea imposed its own logic. An incompetent man in the rigging during a crisis was not merely a problem for himself. Petty officers carried much of this instructional burden in practice. The boatswain, his mates, the gun captains in a naval context. These were the men who worked directly with ordinary and landsmen sailors, who knew each hand's abilities and deficiencies, and who translated the captain's expectations into the daily correction and repetition through which skills actually formed. The distinction between a crew that had been properly trained by capable petty officers and one that had not was visible in crisis, which was precisely when it mattered. Merchant vessels operated with smaller crews relative to their size, which created a different training dynamic. The premium on efficiency meant that a new man was expected to become useful faster, with less institutional tolerance for gradual development. There were no gun drills on a merchant ship, and the elaborate damage control protocols of a man of war were not typically replicated. But the core seamanship requirements, knowing the rigging, understanding sail handling, contributing to the watch without supervision, remained, and merchant officers had their own forms of informal assessment, assigning new men tasks that revealed their capabilities and limitations while the ship was still in manageable conditions. What the drills and training routines shared across different ship types and different centuries was the underlying recognition that knowledge held only in the mind was not sufficient for emergencies. The body had to know. A sailor who could describe how to furl a topsail correctly, but had not done it 50 times in conditions ranging from calm to difficult, would not do it correctly under genuine pressure. The whole system of routine preparation was built around this understanding, and commanders who neglected it, who allowed drill to lapse during quiet passages, who let gun crews go unpracticed for weeks because there was no immediate prospect of engagement, were running a risk that was not always visible until it became catastrophic. There was also a social dimension to drilling that connected it to the morale management discussed earlier. A crew that trained together, that knew each other's positions and capabilities, that had rehearsed responses to shared danger, had a different internal texture from one that had merely worked alongside each other in routine conditions. The shared experience of preparation, even the tedium of running through the same sequence for the 40th time, built a kind of mutual confidence that was not nothing when the real moment came. The ship as training ground was also, in this sense, the ship as community-building institution, creating the conditions under which men who had little choice but to trust each other might actually find grounds for doing so. All of that preparation, the drills, the assigned stations, the repetition, until the body knew what the mind was still processing, existed for moments that arrived without negotiation and left no room for regret. The storm was the most common of those moments, and it was different in kind from everything that preceded it. On an ordinary day at sea, the work was relentless, but it had rhythm. Men moved through their watches, handled their tasks, rested when the schedule allowed, and navigated the discomforts of shipboard life with a kind of hard-won steadiness. Then the weather changed, and all of that steadiness collapsed into something rawer. The sky that had been merely grey became dangerous. The swells that had been merely unpleasant became walls of moving water, and the ship, which had been a floating workplace, became a survival problem that required every able body aboard, regardless of watch, regardless of exhaustion, regardless of whatever task had been underway 10 minutes earlier. The cry of all hands was among the most dreaded sounds a sailor could hear, because it meant the situation had outgrown the capacity of the standing watch to manage it alone. When that call came, men stumbled up from hammocks, abandoned meals, dropped tools and moved, because the alternative to moving quickly was learning what happened when they didn't. There was no distinction between the man who had just come off a 4-hour watch in driving rain and the man who had slept through it. The emergency did not care about the schedule. The first priority in deteriorating weather was the sails. This sounds straightforward until you consider what it actually meant in practice. Reducing sail, reefing or furling canvas, before the wind turned it from an asset into a liability, required men to go aloft. Not to the deck, not to a position where they could brace themselves against something solid, but up into the rigging, out along the yards, working over open water with the mast swinging through arcs that could be 15 or 20 feet at the top, sometimes more in extreme conditions. The foot tropes they stood on were wet and offered uncertain grip. The canvas they were trying to subdue was heavy, stiff, thrashing violently, and entirely indifferent to their attempts to control it. A sail that caught a gust at the wrong moment could throw a man off a yard with no more effort than a horse shaking a fly. The work had to happen anyway, because a ship carrying too much canvas in a gale did not simply slow down. It risked losing masts, broaching, capsizing, breaking apart. Below, the work was different, but not safer. Loose objects became projectiles as the ship rolled. Cargo that had been adequately secured in calm conditions shifted, and shifting cargo changed the ship's centre of gravity in ways that made handling worse and structural stress greater. Men worked to lash down anything that had broken free, bracing themselves against whatever was fixed while the ship lunged and dropped beneath them. Hatches had to be secured against water that was no longer coming, only from above, but from every direction simultaneously. The sea found gaps that had never mattered in ordinary sailing and made them matter urgently. The pumps, already a feature of daily life on aging vessels, became critical in heavy weather. A ship working hard in a seaway, her planks flexing, her caulking stressed, let in water faster than in calm conditions, and the margin between manageable leakage and serious flooding narrowed as the storm continued. Men worked the pump handles in rotation, because the effort required sustained labour that wore through individual capacity quickly, and because stopping was not an option. The exhaustion that accumulated over hours of pumping, combined with the physical battering of being tossed around a heaving deck, produced a kind of degradation that was not simply tiredness. It was the erosion of the capacity to think clearly, to react quickly, to do the next thing correctly, precisely when doing the next thing correctly mattered most. This is where fear entered the equation in a way it did not on ordinary days. Sailors were not fearless. They were experienced with risk, accustomed to discomfort, and trained to manage specific emergencies, but a serious storm pressed against the edges of what training and experience could absorb. The sounds alone were disorienting, the shrieking of wind through the rigging, the crash of water over the bow, the deep groaning of the hull. In those conditions, every task that had been practiced in calm or moderate weather required more effort, more concentration, and more courage than the drill had suggested. The man who knew exactly how to furl a topsail found that knowing and doing diverged sharply when the yard beneath him was swinging wildly and the sail was fighting back. The routine had prepared him. It had not made it easy. What the routine had done, though, was something that became visible in crisis precisely because it would have been invisible otherwise. The sailor who had handled the same lines hundreds of times found that his hands knew where to go even when his mind was occupied with not falling. The crew that had rehearsed working together under pressure had a distributed competence that did not collapse when communication became impossible over the noise of the storm. The assignments, the stations, the automatic responses built through repetition, these were exactly what allowed a ship to function as a coherent system when functioning as a coherent system was the difference between survival and loss. The daily routine had not been preparation in some abstract sense. It had been practice for precisely this. And when the storm passed, when the wind eased, the sea flattened, and the crisis resolved in the direction of survival rather than catastrophe, the drama did not end so much as transform. The emergency became an accounting. Rigging that had carried away needed to be repaired or replaced. Sails that had blown out or torn needed to be brought down, mended if possible, replaced if not. Spars that had been stressed or cracked had to be inspected and dealt with. Water that had come below needed to be pumped out. Stores that had shifted needed to be restored. The men who had been working through the height of the storm, driven by the urgency of immediate crisis, now worked through the aftermath driven by the knowledge that the next weather system was not going to wait for them to be ready. This was, in a sense, the most honest possible description of what bad weather revealed about shipboard life. The storm was not a break from routine that sailors would later describe as adventure. It was an intensification of the same underlying logic that governed every ordinary day. The ship required constant labour to remain functional, and the sea punished the lapse between what was needed and what was done. The crisis revealed why the routine had always mattered, and then the routine resumed, carrying with it whatever the storm had taught until the next one. The aftermath of a storm was one of the few moments when the distinctions that normally organised shipboard life dissolved almost entirely. Every pair of hands was the same pair of hands when the mast was threatening to go over the side. But once the crisis passed, once the pumps slowed, and the rigging was being sorted, and the cook was trying to get a fire going again, those distinctions reasserted themselves because shipboard life was not a uniform experience, and it never had been. The question of what a sailor actually did all day depended enormously on who that sailor was. Start with the most obvious division, rank. A common seaman and a first lieutenant lived aboard the same vessel, breathed the same salt air, ate food that came from the same diminishing stores, and experienced almost entirely different existences. The able seaman worked with his body. His day was measured in physical tasks, hauling lines, going aloft, manning the pumps, holystoning the deck, standing watch in whatever weather arrived. He had little say over what he did or when he did it, and his relationship with the ship was largely one of directed labour. The officer's relationship with the ship was one of directed authority. His labour was cognitive rather than physical, observing, calculating, anticipating, deciding, communicating. He spent time with charts, with logs, with the business of managing men and resources. He was exhausted in a different way, by a different kind of demand, and he was exhausted in a private cabin, however small, rather than in a hammock slung among dozens of others. Between those poles was a wide spectrum. Petty officers, boatswains, gunners, carpenters, their mates, occupied a middle position that combined physical knowledge with supervisory authority. They were the people who actually knew how to do the specialized work that kept the ship functioning, and they were expected both to perform it and to ensure that others performed it correctly. Their days had a texture that differed from ordinary seamen, not just in terms of status, but in terms of problem-solving. A carpenter did not simply work wood. He assessed, diagnosed, and made judgments about structural integrity under conditions where being wrong had irreversible consequences. Then there were those who were not sailors at all, even when they were aboard. Marines on naval vessels occupied a peculiar position present on the ship, subject to naval authority in some respects, yet belonging to an entirely separate service with its own discipline and identity. On a typical day, a Marine did not handle sails or work rigging. His duties centered on order and security, standing guard at the officers' quarters and the magazine, being available for boarding actions or shore operations, and performing the military drilling that kept him a soldier rather than a sailor. He was, in a sense, a passenger with a function, tolerated by the crew, sometimes resented for being exempt from seamanship labour, and occupying a social space that neither fully belonged to the ship's culture nor stood entirely outside it. At the youngest end of the spectrum were the ship's boys, and their experience deserves particular attention because it was genuinely distinct from everyone else's. Boys as young as 10 or 11 served aboard naval and merchant vessels, officially as servants or learners, practically as the lowest rung on a hierarchy that had several rungs below comfortable. They ran messages, fetched things, assisted officers with personal tasks, and learned the ship by doing everything nobody else wanted to do. Some officers' servants in the Royal Navy were being trained toward eventual promotion. Others were simply being used. The physical demands placed on small bodies in a punishing environment, combined with the social vulnerability of being the youngest and most powerless person aboard, made their days something qualitatively different from what the adult seaman experienced, harder in some respects, more uncertain, and marked by a dependency that older sailors had at least partially escaped. Skill level transformed the nature of daily labour in ways that were not simply about status. An able seaman had earned that designation through demonstrated competence. He could hand, reef and steer, could work aloft in difficult conditions, understood the rigging well enough to function independently. An ordinary seaman was learning, which meant his labour was supervised. His assignments were simpler, and his margin for error was slightly wider because he was expected to be in the process of becoming capable rather than already there. The distinction mattered practically, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of what you were asked to do when the situation became critical. Ability assigned you to the most demanding stations, which was recognition of a kind, though perhaps not the kind most men would have chosen. The type of voyage introduced variations so significant that comparing a naval warship to a whaling vessel to an exploration ship sometimes feels like comparing different occupations rather than different instances of the same one. A naval sailor lived inside a military structure where hierarchy was enforced by law, discipline was formal and sometimes brutal, and the mission was primarily strategic rather than commercial. A merchant sailor worked within a smaller crew, often with less formal hierarchy, but also less protection, and his daily labour was shaped by the commercial logic of getting cargo from one place to another as efficiently as possible. A whaler's experience differed from both. He endured extraordinarily long voyages, often years at a time, with stretches of genuine monotony punctuated by the violent, dangerous, and highly skilled work of the hunt itself. The whale hunt was the point of the voyage in a way that no single task was the point aboard other ships, and the waiting that surrounded it had a particular psychological weight. Exploration voyages generated their own distinct rhythms, shaped by uncertainty that other voyages could partly avoid. The merchant captain knew roughly where he was going and what he would find. The explorer, by definition, did not, and this shaped everything from the duties of the officers, heavy on observation, recording and measurement, to the emotional experience of the crew, who lived with an ambient uncertainty about what lay ahead, that could manifest as excitement or as a special kind of dread, depending on the man and the moment. Nationality and era added further layers of variation. A Dutch sailor in the 17th century, a French sailor in the 18th, an American sailor in the 19th. Each worked within a different national tradition, a different set of naval regulations or commercial practices, a different culture of command that shaped how authority was exercised and how compliance was extracted. Some captains were genuinely concerned with the welfare of their crews. Others treated men as machinery to be worn out and replaced. The formal rules of a given navy told you something about daily life, but command style could override formal rules in both directions, making a theoretically harsh system livable or a theoretically reasonable one miserable. What this all points toward is something worth holding on to. There was no single sailor experience to be recovered or described. When we ask what sailors actually did all day, we are asking about an enormously diverse range of people operating across centuries, in different maritime cultures, under different commands, with different skills and different statuses, aboard vessels built for purposes that shaped every hour of the time spent aboard them. The experiences overlapped. Certainly the sea was the same sea. The physical demands of sailing were fundamentally similar, but the life of a 12-year-old captain's servant was not the life of a seasoned, able seaman, which was not the life of a whaling harpooner, which was not the life of a naval lieutenant. The richness of maritime history lies partly in that diversity, and the mistake would be flattening it into a single story when the reality was always more complicated, more varied and more human than any single account could hold. So what did sailors actually do all day? After everything, the watches and the scrubbing, the sail handling and the pumping, the meagre meals and the cramped hammocks, the boredom and the sudden terror, the honest answer is both simpler and more demanding than the popular imagination tends to allow. They worked constantly, repetitively, physically, and with a level of skill that most people on land would never develop and rarely had occasion to appreciate. The romantic image of the sailor, wind-burned and free, gazing toward some distant horizon with adventure in his eyes, captures something real about the emotional texture of life at sea, the genuine vastness of the ocean, the genuine thrill of landfall after weeks of nothing. But it omits almost everything that actually filled the hours. The horizon was there, yes, so was the holystone, so was the tar bucket, so was the pump handle, rising and falling, because the ship was always taking on water, and the water always had to go somewhere. What kept a wooden sailing vessel alive was not heroism in any dramatic sense. It was the accumulated weight of 10,000 small acts performed correctly, day after day, by men who were too tired to be romantic about any of it. Scrubbing the deck was not a chore imposed on top of real sailing work. It was part of what kept the deck sound. Checking the rigging was not maintenance separate from seamanship. It was seamanship. Every task was connected to every other task, and every task was connected to the ship's continued ability to float and move and keep the people aboard it alive. That interconnection was invisible when things went well and catastrophically obvious when something was neglected. Boredom and fear lived side by side in a relationship that sailors probably stopped finding strange after the first few months. The long stretches of watch standing with nothing happening trained the mind toward a kind of suspended alertness, not quite relaxed, not quite tense, present to the possibility of sudden demand without being consumed by it. And when the demand came, when the weather turned, or the rigging carried away, or a coastline appeared where no coastline was expected, the transition was immediate and total. The body that had been slowly going numb with cold on a quiet watch was suddenly expected to perform at the limit of its capability, aloft in the dark, in wet canvas and howling wind, with consequences for failure that required no elaboration. What made that possible? What made it survivable across voyages that lasted months or years was the camaraderie that formed among men living in close quarters under shared hardship. It was not always warm, it was not always uncomplicated. Resentments built up in tight spaces, and hierarchies created real divisions. But there was something that knit a working crew together that was distinct from friendship in the ordinary sense, a functional solidarity forged by shared labour, shared risk, and the simple fact that the man next to you on the yard was the reason you made it back down to the deck. You depended on each other in ways that most human relationships never approach, and that dependency left a mark. The maritime myths we inherited, the swashbuckling, the freedom, the noble struggle against the elements, are not entirely false, but they have a tendency to make the sea into a stage and the sailor into a kind of hero defined by dramatic moments. The reality is that the dramatic moments were real but rare, and what surrounded them was labour, routine. The same tasks at the same hours, governed by bells, enforced by hierarchy, sustained by the collective competence of people who had learned their work through years of doing it under conditions designed to teach hard lessons quickly. A sailor's day was not a story. It was a system of watches and duties and skills and risks that repeated itself across the ocean and across the centuries, varying by rank and ship type and era, but always organised around the same central fact. The sea does not accommodate incompetence, and it does not reward neglect. What sailors actually did all day was maintain a fragile, complex, improbable machine against a force that was indifferent to their survival, and they did it well enough, often enough, that ships crossed oceans and returned home, and the whole enterprise of maritime history became possible. That is not a small thing. It is, in its own way, extraordinary.